Batman for the PC Engine, released in 1990 by Sunsoft and based on the 1989 Tim Burton-helmed film of the same name, is a peculiar game because it is such a departure from other Bat titles released on other platforms at the time. Rather than a side-scrolling action game in the vein of the excellent NES version, or even the adequate Genesis version, or whatever you got on the Game Boy, what we get on the Turbo is an overhead maze game where you control a slow-moving Batman through these labyrinths and perform these different tasks while fending off enemies with your slow-ass Batarang. Indeed, the first time I played this game, it took me about 10 minutes of play before deciding that this game was lame and I moved on to something else. Some time would pass before I would give Batman on the PC Engine another shot, and I have decidedly mixed feelings regarding this outing of the Caped Crusader. On the one hand, the overall concept is not quite the best use of the franchise, but at the same time, while I find myself playing through this very un-Batman Batman game, I found myself enjoying it bit by bit. But on the other hand, there are certain aspects of the game that damper that enjoyment somewhat, and that's where the mixed feelings comes in. Batman comprises 4 parts, each with 12 stages apiece. The first part has you collecting tainted cosmetics off the Gotham streets. The second part has you cleaning graffiti off paintings in a museum. You're shitting me, right? The third part tasks you with planting bombs throughout the Axis chemical plant. And the fourth and final part has you snipping cords, holding Joker's gas-filled balloons. While doing this, you'll have to fend off against the superstitious and cowardly lot, as well as other potential hazards, such as these warp tiles that will propel Batman to another part of the level and potentially run into a wayward enemy. God fucking damn it, Sticalis! Conveyor belts, and incoming traffic. Yeah, thanks, son of a bitch. Batman's only offensive weapon is his signature Batarang, and when you begin a new game, it is a woeful weapon. It has a short range, it's slow in motion, and worst of all, while the Batarang is in flight, Batman is unable to move, which leaves him vulnerable to attack. Oh, and by the way, one hit is more than enough to do the Dark Knight in. Fortunately, there are power-ups that will increase the speed and range of your Batarang as well as allow you to toss more than one. You can also find speed boots that make Batman move faster and invincibility stars that are fairly self-explanatory. Now again, one hit downs the Batman, but fortunately you respawn at the last point you died, with all your power-ups intact making life a little more bearable. Once all your lives are exhausted, it's game over. You do have unlimited continues as well as a rather unique password system, but neither retains your upgrades and you start a new game with bare-bone abilities, which makes things less bearable, especially in later levels where things can get a little heated. Batman takes a while to get going, particularly whenever you start a new game because you're severely underpowered when you start. Continuing via continue after a game over or password will also leave you at starting levels, and yeah, it sucks. You're slow as shit, your attack has limited range, and everyone's running around ramming you up the ass while you're waiting for your Batarang to come back to you because you're frozen in place while the fucker's on screen. If you were playing this for the first time and after a while you got bored with it or thought maybe this game sucked bat guano, I wouldn't blame you because it happened to me too. Not to mention the very premise in and of itself seems like an odd style of game for this particular character. It's just a maze game where you're collecting stuff, and honestly, it's not something one would expect from one of the most popular superhero icons. Take that aspect of the equation aside and you're left with a game that, while slow at start, eventually picks up steam, and by the time you're fully powered, things get a little more tolerable, perhaps a little more interesting, perhaps even a little more enjoyable. Certainly my enjoyment of the game increased once Batman felt like someone who could hold his own, and tackling these tougher levels felt like less of a chore. And that's when you discover neat things like Batarangs being able to pass through walls, which opens up possible strategies for disabling certain foes. Less neat are the warp tiles and conveyor belts, both designed to transport you to other parts of the level and also possibly leaving you exposed to a last-second collision with an enemy. In any event, despite a couple quibbles, Batman's core gameplay is at the very least functional for the most part, controls fairly responsive with little to no delay save for those imposed by the game itself, fairly simple to figure out, the D-pad moves and both buttons shoot. Not much more to it. Oh yeah, by the way, at the end of all these stages, there's a boss gauntlet where you fight a couple bosses, including eventually the final encounter with the Joker. Unfortunately, I forgot to film any of this stuff, so sorry. Batman looks pretty good for an overhead maze game, with the overall visuals doing a fair enough job of recreating the film world into a 16-bit format. The colors are fairly rich, the character designs are pretty good given their smallest stature, and while there will be the occasional bout of slowdown with too much stuff going on, it's never to the point of being too detrimental. The brief cutscenes that play in between levels are actually well done, and do an adequate job of moving what little there is of the plot forward. Much like the NES and Mega Drive versions, Batman lacks any of the music from the Danny Elfman composed film score, instead opting for a small selection of original tunes and even a couple tunes lifted from the NES game, which is probably the smartest thing they could have done because those tunes are awesome. The rest of the game's original tracks are a little more acquired taste, but they are also fairly catchy little jingles that could only exist on the PC engine because everyone else is hardcore or something. I don't know where I was going with that, but whatever. I don't care. I'm leaving it in. Batman for PC Engine never got localized outside Japanese soil, and in all honesty, I don't think we missed much here. As a game on its own merits, it's a perfectly serviceable little maze game that has a slow start and a few quirks, but once things pick up steam, it starts to become a little more fun. When held up against other Batman games on other platforms, by which I mean those based on the same movie, that's where it falls a little short considering its uniqueness compared to other games. This is definitely one of those mileage varying games, but otherwise Batman is perfectly fine video game fodder. If you don't mind a different kind of cape crusading, so to speak, then this might be worth checking out.
I have to go now. My planet needs me.